So today I wanted to share a little bit about the stuff that I ended up cutting out of my book, which I'm not really cutting it out, like Jordan Peterson says, don't throw away anything. And really, it's already planning to be another book. The final volume here is about just under 300,000 words, and what I had originally tried to publish, which was like phone book size, was about 340. This is about 290, I think. So it was about 50,000 words that I cut out. But and what it was is it was on a couple subjects, but in an overlapping way. So I had more chapters on the topic of, like, I've talked about autism quite a bit, but I expanded that to be about not just that, but mental health, and like, why is there such a proliferation of diagnoses from my perspective, looking at it through my perspective, my own experience. I'm seeing it as like a canary in the coal mine sort of thing, and so the great abundance of diagnosis is showing that there's problems in the culture. So that was one aspect of it, but it was also largely about relationships between men and women that I was focusing on, and who and how those things interact, because obviously there's a great breakdown of the problems between men and women, and I think that those mental health issues are both symptomatic and contributing to that. Because we've lost our cultural scripts about how we are supposed to behave as men and women, and it's causing different kinds of problems for men and women. So maybe you could say, in a sense, like, the men are becoming more autistic and the women are becoming more schizophrenic or paranoid. Yep. So that those are like some of the differences or something, and the interaction between men and women is breaking down. So I'm not going to really talk about the mental health aspect so much, but more what I wanted to go through is, because I kept working on it, and essentially I needed to publish the book because I realized, like, at a certain point, like, okay, I tried to put some of this stuff in. I had a cutoff point where I just kind of wrapped things up, but it was not really done. I wasn't really done researching it and fleshing out the ideas, but I realized, like, I can't finish it or the book will never come out, and really it is like enough stuff for a separate volume. Not so thick as this one, hopefully not, I don't think so, but if it's about a sixth of what I have written is about a sixth of the size of this, so maybe like 120 pages, and then hopefully, like, I can wrap it up at like 200 pages or something like that. I think that's reasonable. Probably more reasonable to expect people to actually read a book like that. But I also think it does have a tighter narrative flow, because what I kind of did is I was looking at kind of a timeline of how the different cultural scripts for men and women have evolved over time, I guess you could say, or what changed culturally, and what John Vervaeke would talk about as like psychotechnologies, a new way of just doing life that doesn't necessarily require material technological innovation, but it's just about the way that we interact with each other. And so I'm going to kind of go through what I kind of wrote out my timeline. I'm going to kind of go over what I have here. So starting up here, Genesis 2, the Genesis 2 ideal, which, to say, like, okay, this is prior to the fall. Adam goes through an ordeal. He has to search all of creation, naming the animals, uncovering everything that's there, to internalize his own understanding that it's not good for man to be alone, which God already saw. So God saw it, puts Adam through this ordeal. Then the woman is revealed, and it's the institution of marriage is right there. A man will leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and they'll become one flesh. And so the ideal is a voluntary union. Um, the man and the woman are both made in the image of God, both equal in that sense, but they are complementary opposites. You know, there's they have different trade-offs. You know, and it's a balanced difference. You know, yin and yang, obviously masculine and feminine. One is not greater than the other. So the way I say it, the Genesis 2 ideal is a voluntary union, masculine and feminine agentic freedom. That's their ability to choose, coexist in masculine and feminine arenic freedom. So that's the environment. You know, they live in the paradise Garden of Eden. So there's nothing in the environment that's keeping them from relating to each other like at the highest level, and there's nothing within them, because they are not fallen, that is keeping them from being what the other person needs. So that's the ideal. And I would say that that ideal has always had the possibility to exist within individual relationships, and probably has throughout history. Like throughout history, and you know, a few places in the Bible and things like that, there probably are individual men and women that had beautiful, wonderful marriages where they were both loving one another and appreciating one another equally, and they were equally happy and fulfilled in all the ways they would desire, regardless of what the cultural script was. So, so that's what I'm saying. Like, that was the ideal. Then the Genesis 3 and Genesis 4 corruption. Obviously, that's the snake enticing Eve. So that's feminine compassion subverted through temptation. And then with Cain and Abel, it's the masculine competition subverted through temptation. And what it introduces the need for active participation in both husbandry and fraternity. Now, I have this thing color-coded. So basically, anything that's purple is like, this is good for men and women. Anything that's pink is like, this is a good, especially for the female, or you know, highlights the feminine aspect, and it's a net positive for the woman. Blue is something that's kind of a net positive for the man. And then red is like a negative. Anything that's red is a negative thing that's been introduced. Okay, so there's a good feminine aspect here in Eve's compassion, and a good masculine element in the competition between Cain and Abel. But both of those things get subverted, and it introduces a need for a more active participation. So Adam fails because he doesn't actively husband his wife. He did not adequately instruct her or provide for her to deal with that on her own. He was present, but he wasn't speaking. And then he doesn't take responsibility for it. And the same thing with Cain. He does not take responsibility for what happens to his brother. So, you know, the sort of positive virtues that are introduced through those negative examples is that, like, one, a husband needs to lay down his life for his wife. He's the one that should take the fall, not the woman. He definitely shouldn't blame her. The blaming of women is a big cause of problems throughout this story as it changes over time. And then with the brothers, you know, you should be your brother's keeper. And that's what you eventually get at the end of the book of Genesis with Joseph. Joseph is his brother's keeper. He does a good job. Okay, so those things are introduced there. Now, the big one is the Genesis 6 corruption, as far as relationships between men and women go. And I'm categorizing this as the introduction of barbarism, which is masculine agentic freedom elevated to the highest ideal. And basically, it's a corruption of masculine strength, power, to take women. And that's what it says. And it does not matter, really, if you believe that it's angelic beings doing this or humans, because the effect of it, you know, as we go through history, is that divinity is something that is attributed to powerful humans anyway, and the net effect is the same. Basically, men who are stronger than women, whether we call them gods, giants, or just kings or powerful men, use their strength to just take the woman that they want physically and have their way with them, and to make them their wife. But it's really that using the masculine power to engage in sexual activity. So that is the corruption that's introduced in Genesis 6, and I think my interpretation of that whole thing is that ultimately it leads to a fertility collapse, probably because of inbreeding. So, like, I think when Noah and his family are on the ark, it was not a small number of people escaping from a massive civilization, but a small number of people being preserved out of a civilization that had already largely collapsed of its own corruption. But so going forward in the post-flood, era, you have the Abrahamic solution, which is the introduction of patriarchy. And I have patriarchy here as purple because real patriarchy, as it's supposed to be, was a good thing. It was a improvement over barbarism. And what it does is patriarchy uses the masculine agentic freedom, the man's strength and his ability to impose his will through power to protect women. But it does so by creating separate male and female ecosystems. So with any kind of patriarchal system, you always have a largely male domain and a female domain, and then the men and women only really come together within marriage for the purpose of procreation, but they're not necessarily working side by side. They're not rearing the children side by side. The men are raising the boys, the women are raising the girls. So you have these things, because so that it's separate male and female ecosystems. It's supported by the shadow matriarchy, which allows women to keep masculine agentic freedom in check through the regulation of feminine arenic freedom. And so this is something we still notice in like the thing of this behavior, even though there isn't much of a shadow matriarchy left. If you watch kind of like the home math videos or something, women will always say that all the women are 10s. They will always tell all the women that they are all beautiful. And they basically, it's like it's extremely difficult to get a woman to honestly admit, I think I'm prettier than that girl, or that girl is prettier than me. They all just say, oh, she's so beautiful. And this is what they do. They prop up their ugly friend and try to, they all get on the same page to get her a man or whatever. But then, they have their whole competition happening behind the scenes. Also, the biblical example you can take a look at to see this in play is like with Leah and Rachel. They are the ones that are determining what Jacob is going to do on a nightly basis between them and their handmaidens. Jacob's got 4 wives, but he does not have control over what happens. So the shadow matriarchy, the feminine control of the arena and control of the freedom within the arena, is keeping things in check despite whatever he may want to do. So and he knows essentially if he was to just try to do something, those women are going to make his life a living hell. So that's how it works. That's how patriarchy works. And so then I would say basically from the pagan era, from Abraham onward through to the advent of Christianity, patriarchy and barbarism coexist in tension within every strata of society. So, you have like Israel is more of a patriarchal nation. They're supposed to live in contrast to the Canaanites, but they don't necessarily do that. They they have a struggle internally to obey their own laws and to keep away from those practices of barbarism, which often revolve around idol worship, but it's always has that element of barbaric sexuality. Um, and so and the same thing would happen, could even happen, say, within the confines of a society that's overwhelmingly patriarchal. You can still have a man who within his own house runs that house more like a barbarian than a good patriarch. So so this really happens like at every strata. These things are battling. Um, and I would say that really what happens is, at least within the civilized area, once you get to 313, Constantine, all that, the era of Christendom, um, patriarchy basically overcomes barbarism on the official level. And what's introduced here is the concept of chastity. And chastity is a Christian virtue. Chastity values sexuality. The true good definition of chastity is that it does place a high value on sexuality. It polices sexual behavior because sexuality is holy, and so it only celebrates it within the proper context. It delays gratification. But also introduced through this time period, is asceticism. And asceticism elevates that delayed gratification to the highest value. And it very easily can fall into a sex negative anti-materialism worldview. So, this is maybe like some of the Gnostic influence in Christianity. It's where, to say, you have now a class system evolving where virginity and like becoming a nun or a monk or whatever is seen as a higher calling than being married. And some of this is based in the interpretation of Paul's letter to the Corinthians and things like that. But I would say that it has a negative effect overall. I think historically it was probably a necessary period to help kind of let the old barbaric instincts kind of go extinct. It served a purpose because I don't know, maybe because it attracts the people that are the more extreme. So the biggest hedonists could go just as hard into asceticism. The normal people were still enjoying marriage in the right way. And of course, so as I have here, patriarchy replaces barbarism, but barbarism goes underground in corrupt circles. So this is the same thing where those things, now everybody's going to officially like have one wife, and officially, marriage is the proper domain of sexuality. But the men within those marriage, some of them are really, they're snakes, they're wolves in sheep's clothing. So they're following the forms, but the behavior goes underground. And this is something that happens anytime when like there's an official kind of party change or change in the culture at large. The people who are the true believers are the first to adopt it, and then the second to adopt it is going to be the people who don't care about basically the psychopaths or whatever, the people who are perfectly willing to say that they are doing all the right things without caring, because they don't care about being honest. So that's a very dangerous thing, which will crop up later in this thing. So basically, between that early era of Christendom, we do have an elevation of the monastic orders and the celibate lifestyle, and that continues and goes on. And then around the Middle Ages, I'm putting it as like the age of chivalry. And chivalry, I think, is really important. And one of the things I'm studying is, there you go, Parzival. Because this is one of the, like notable works that really introduces that idea and that whole code of chivalry. So chivalry replaces patriarchy in some ways. I would say, there's still a patriarchal element, within marriage and Christendom. And I have the, and it combats frontier barbarism. So chivalry this is because what's happening is that the the geographic location of the Roman Empire, or where the Christianity is spreading out into the frontiers, so into the northern parts of Europe and places where that were less developed. There was a Roman presence there, but it was just there was a lot more pagans or whatever. The Romans were ruling over the pagans, but the culture was not integrated like it was toward the center of the empire. So there's still, in those pagan areas, there's still a lot of barbarism going on. You got Vikings and all those kind of people. And so so chivalry is happening out there. And I, a really great book that basically talks a lot about this is this one here, Men and Marriage by George Gilder. Civilization is built by men with families to feed. That's the tagline there. And, he really goes through this thing of, the problem with barbarism is that it creates these single men. Or he's basically saying, like, teenagers, unmarried men are barbarians. Like, by nature, marriage is part of the, like, civilizing factor. Now, I would say that's true, but it is only true within a civilization that's built to work that way. But not necessarily. There are probably, unless even to say, like, sometimes within those barbarian circles, I'm sure there were Viking husbands that had true, loving, good relationships with their wives, and it was a beautiful thing, but it was probably a rare thing. It was the exception, not the rule for their culture. And so chivalry is pink because chivalry is a net gain for women, as it brings the masculine virtues of competition and fraternity into a form that elevates chastity and rewards men for delaying or forgoing their own self-interests. So basically, what chivalry does is, on some scale, it allows men to work together and for the greater good. And so then all the men, they're protecting the farm instead of raiding the farm, and then they are able to get wives through peaceful interaction. And sometimes it may mean that, like, the knight goes and fights, and he's going to die, and he's not going to get a wife. But because of his sacrifice, like, his brother will marry that woman. But what it also does is it also does give women choice. Like, that's part of the code that's in there. So the example, I'd say is, a barbarian and a knight are both using their power and their might to, like, take a woman, rescue her from wherever, they're both throwing the woman over their arm, over their shoulder, and physically taking her out of there. But the difference is that when she gets to the Viking camp, she's now his wife. When she gets to the castle, she has the freedom to leave if she wants to. And that freedom also affords her the opportunity to choose willingly to participate in marriage. So, and there's a lot of evidence of like how this basically, like, voluntary marriage is one of the things that built European culture and caused it to explode in such a good way. I mean, because if you think about it, a man who knows that his wife is supporting him, he doesn't have to worry about, like, managing her and trying to feed the family and all this stuff. So it allows cooperation between the sexes, which builds society far better. But there's an interesting element kind of picking up on this. And so in this version of Parzival, which is based on the version by Wolfram von Eschenbach, and the story of Parzival is based, like, there's an earlier one that comes out of France. This comes out of Germany. So de Tretain de Troyes is the one that writes, like, the French version, the French original, and Eschenbach is from Germany, and there's a big difference in, like, the attitudes toward sex and sexuality and things like that. in France, which is, even though they're both Catholic at the time, this is prior to the Reformation, prior to the Reformation, some of those like cultural distinctions are present in this, which I thought was a very interesting thing as I was reading the introduction here. Because in Detroit's version in France, it's like all the knights are basically unmarried, and it's like they see foregoing marriage as part of their like sacred duty. So it very much has more of that monastic feel, or that two-tiered system where like the best thing you could do is to be celibate and devote your body to God in that way, and then the second best thing is marriage, like marriage as second-class citizens. Whereas in Eschenbach's, like all the knights are married, and it has that sort of practical view of marriage. It's not necessarily overtly romantic, or that like a wife is supposed to help her husband, like they work together. So and I think when you look at like the way that Arthurian stuff is romanticized and stuff like that, that's uncommon. I think when you remove the spiritual aspect of it, you kind of have like the elevation of like true love is the thing, and that makes like the acquisition of the woman the highest thing. But then the story ends. And so the interesting thing, I haven't dug into it very much yet, but the interesting thing I'm interested to see how it plays out is how these men are doing this quest, and there's a purpose for the quest, but it's not like their own romantic entanglement that's the object, but the woman is there helping them. And really, and from my own perspective, I think that is a virtuous way to look at things. So either way, chivalry helps to elevate chastity over asceticism, especially in that more German way of looking at it. And then the next thing we get to is the Reformation, which obviously starts with Luther and all that. But I think that the important thing, for the sake of understanding like male and female relationships, you do have some really good things there with like Martin Luther getting married to Katerina. Yeah, right. And then there's another one that another example that I really like comes from this book here, 32 Christians Who Changed Their World. And let me see. Okay, and it is Katharina Schutz-Zell. And the interesting thing is that she is not long after, what was that? Yeah, 1497 or 98 to 1562. So, like, right in, she's one of her and her husband are one of the early groups of, like, the, what would come to be called Lutherans, but getting married after Martin Luther right there. And the interesting thing is that her husband is a pastor, but he's relatively unknown. But he allowed his wife, he gave her the freedom to use her gifts. She was a very gifted writer, a theologian. She wrote songs. She had like long discourses with other theologians through letters. And so this is why I say, like, it's a return of this voluntary union that's, I think, closer to the ideal, that the Genesis 2 ideal. And it's why I say I think that this always can emerge at any point in history or culture, that a man and a woman can have such a relationship. But I think that the changes that occur during the Reformation allow it to happen more easily and, become more common. So voluntary union is reintroduced at the level of the individual relationship. So that's an important thing. Chivalry coexists, and so now I'm going to get to this is all kind of happening all at the same time, but it exists with a more economically corrupt patriarchy. But what happens is as it's attenuated by civilization, it results in like the gentry, gentlemen, lords and ladies, because at a certain point there's no more barbarians to fight. You have these nation states or whatever that can fight each other. You start to have religious conflicts where people can fight each other, but those are such more messier conflicts. It's not good versus evil. And so Shakespeare's plays, all his romances and such, always take place like in Italy. And so the examples I picked at in Romeo and Juliet in this book, there is a section on that. Romeo and Juliet exposes the arenic issues of the society. Because the problem is that like Romeo and Juliet should be together. They are the right match for each other, but it's cultural and societal forces that are keeping their relationship from being possible. So that's an issue. And then the other example that I looked at a lot in my writing and will continue to study more is The Taming of the Shrew, which exposes the limitations and weaknesses of the economically corrupt patriarchy. So what's saying there is, there still is this patriarchal form. Like women are supposed to consent, but really it's like, the people with money are the ones that get their way. They're the ones that get to grease the wheels. And, it's another example of basically at the end of that play, Caterina and Petruchio do have the best relationship because he's basically saying, tells her, look, this is the form of the system that we work in where I'm supposed to be the man and I'm supposed to be in charge. But if you will submit to the rule or whatever that I'm putting forth, you are going to have the most amount of freedom because like unlike everybody else in the play who basically is like just sees women as commodities, he is looking for a true partner, but he has to do it within the system that's in place. So those are some ones. I think there's a lot to be unpacked in those that would be, I think, helpful for figuring out some of our problems today. And then the next era or whatever, the next thing that happens is the Enlightenment. And this is so this is an interesting thing because that Reformation really takes place in Germany and then spreads to England. That's where Shakespeare is. The Enlightenment as a separate entity, which they always get lumped together, but there is very clear, distinct things. It emerges from that Catholic background in France where it was more resistance to what was going on in Germany, and the Catholic, I would say the ascetic ideal had more influence there. But the person that I really want to highlight is Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his book from 1761, Julie or the New Heloise. And, he's got all these political and philosophical ideas that he's introducing. He introduces the idea of the social contract, and basically he wants people to have as much freedom to do whatever they want as they can. His famous thing, man is born free, but everywhere is in chains. So he's saying like, society as it's right now is not working because everybody's enslaved by all this societal stuff. Now, I think he's a snake in the grass. Well, he definitely is. He grows up in Geneva, Calvin's Geneva, but close to 200 years later. And he's, and the thing is that fundamentally it's like if you were to compare Geneva, even in the 1700s, to like, I don't know, ancient Greece or something, or especially, or whatever was going on in Switzerland at that time, the Helvetians or whatever who was in charge, like it's an objectively better situation for everybody. There's more food, there's more freedom, there's more opportunity, there's better relationships between men and women. But Rousseau, and he even gets it from his family, like his family are all basically like people that put on the forms and the patterns that society expects them, acting Christ-like or acting as Christians, but there's so much like cheating and adultery that's all through his family history, and he's just kind of like the next perpetuation of it. So, but the really interesting thing is that he introduces these ideas in the form of a romance novel, basically. And what he puts in there is this elevation of female agentic freedom, like which is something that women want and desire. And this is a known thing. Like, women want the right to choose for themselves. They don't want to be told by powerful men what to do. But basically, he really subverts that whole thing. And essentially, it's like the women. So chivalry is one. Women have more rights than ever and more freedoms, but he's basically taking the voice of the serpent, whispering in their ears, and telling them to look at the men that are in charge and say, no, those men aren't protecting your rights and freedoms. They are enslaving you. They are, capturing you. And then basically, so because if you say like chivalry is one, the men in charge are the knights, not the barbarians. He's telling the women to be suspicious of those knights in charge, and then instead like look at what is forbidden, the forbidden, what those men are keeping from you, your ability to go and choose for yourself the man that you want. But the man that the woman wants is always this snake in the grass who comes in and whispers these ideas. And basically it's a wolf in sheep's clothing. It's a man who acts like a barbarian in his motivation, but who follows the rules so that he can get inside the castle. And basically this script, I would say, has essentially been maintained in like the female romance novel ever since, right to the present day, which is, it's the female equivalent of like pornography, in these books. And it's always about this like man who is, it's like that dark triad man or whatever, he's a sociopath, but the woman basically is like, that's the fantasy that they've been fed. And I think so. I think one of the big problems here, and this is what I'm trying to figure out, is I think that fantasy has gone largely ignored and been in the female ecosystem. So like in what women have been reading, and women start writing the stories for women, and everything that's for women, it has that serpentine whisper in there right up to the present day. Because here's where there's a split. So because basically, it's introducing covetous, illicit desires into the women that are already married, or the women that are going to be married to the good guy. And basically, for men, the noble gentry is still the best path for them. It's still the best path for them to get married, have a happy life, all that stuff. Culture is still incentivizing them to behave well, but the women are slowly being primed for seduction by duplicitous actors. Now, and I would say this gentry has always been sort of corrupt. There's always a little bit more leeway for the man to have a woman on his side or whatever. There is always a little bit of that element there. But, I would say, even though that's the case, the men were always deceiving themselves if they thought that they were better off by having that instead of just trying to have a good relationship with their actual wife. So then the next thing that comes is the Industrial Revolution and Darwin, and there's always a whole swirl of characters you can introduce with all these eras, but I'm just kind of looking at the ones as they touch on these subjects. So 1859, Origin of Species. Within the next 10 years, it's just wide acceptance. Even though there's not good ways to empirically verify it. The idea was so appealing to the people basically in charge, or whatever, society wide, that it just caught on, and so it was accepted before the scientific experiments that could have really brought some pushback were even devised or possible. And so it's kind of like, in my opinion, we have like 200 years of confirmation bias on it. But that's neither here nor there. But what it does do is, so it introduces survival of the fittest, that idea, and it affects both the economy and the culture, because this is happening at the same time as the Industrial Revolution. And then the idea of like natural selection reinduces the barbarism of Rousseau's noble savage to men. So Rousseau had this idea of the noble savage, and that like that true man was this like noble savage, and with like, and that's what he was wanting to get to be the man that could do whatever he wants. He was not as bold as like the Marquis de Sade. He was way more sneaky, and so his more immediate influence was on women than it was on men. I would say he had more an effect of that. But once Darwin's theory is introduced, it gives this powerful backing to this noble savage idea, and basically it gave it the firepower that Rousseau didn't have on his own. And then industrialization fundamentally changes family dynamics, because the economic unit was like separated. So instead of like the household economy, you now have this men going to the cities to go work in the factories, and that just changed like huge impact. And let's see, Nancy Pearcey's book, she really talks a lot about this in The Toxic War on Masculinity. She covers a lot of this stuff in good details, but I'm pulling in some things that I think are also she doesn't speak on. So okay, and so then what that leads to, I would say, in the next thing, modernity in the 20th century, the big change here is Sigmund Freud and his theory of sexuality. And psychology essentially becomes the new priesthood for scientism, as I will call it. Secular materialism has replaced religion. Science, it is scientism, and psychology is like the priesthood of that. So Freud's thing is the elevation of the male libido, and masculine agentic freedom is given a total pass in the area of sexuality. Freud's really messed up. He's got a lot of stuff. Like, he had a lot of issues for somebody who's, trying to describe everybody else's issues. But basically, once his ideas become widely accepted, it's like just that's where we get this thing that's so latent in this assumption that like men have basically no control over their sexual impulses, even though the whole point of like chivalry was that society benefited when men took control of their sexual urges. We basically decided, no, men don't have that ability. And masculine agentic freedom is given a pass in the area of sexuality. And my little side note was that Freud's conception of male sexuality becomes so dominant that it affects the core assumptions of Christians in the purity culture movement. So like purity culture, okay, so purity, or that idea, the idea is the idea of chastity, that sex belongs within marriage. But the people that kind of reformulated and repopularized this idea, they just took Freud's assumptions for granted, which is basically to say that like the way they framed it was like women need to dress modestly and all this stuff because men can't control themselves. And it totally just gives men a free pass. And it influences men too, because it's while men are reading the same materials or whatever, they're reading these books and they're being told that they don't have any self-control. And of course, pornography has become more prevalent. Once you have just even, I do talk about in this book, in my book. I think once you get to like the age of advertising with Edward Bernays and photography on all this stuff, then you have this proliferation of the female image everywhere, feminine beauty. And then you have movie stars and TV stars, and you have women that can be models. And, it's just so much more present, which, keeps going on, with television and things like that until you get to the internet age. But Freud is really the one that's like at the heart of that shift, just in the basic assumptions we make about men and women. And so around that time, that's also when you have women's suffrage. Women's suffrage is really a response to masculine abdication of responsibility. So basically, like, men are not being raised in church, they're not being raised in this environment. They're being told they have to go to the city, be in competition with each other, Darwinian survival of the fittest, but on an economic basis, like fighting for jobs, which is removed like the fraternal aspect of masculine culture. And so that means there's also no men keeping other men in check in regards to how they relate to other women. And so the men are abandoning the women. They're abandoning if they have wives, the wives are at home with the children and they're off in the city getting drunk or whatever. So you have women's suffrage, and the prohibition is connected with all that. It was really, that stuff really came out of the fact that men had abandoned their responsibilities through this time period. And then, of course, you get to the sexual revolution. Birth control and abortion remove the consequence of female promiscuity. Kinsey is a big deal. He uses science to advocate for every manner of sexual expression. Second wave feminism advocated for the female adoption of the sexual ethics born from the Freudian concept of the libido. And it labels all prior forms of relational frameworks as the patriarchy. So basically, Freud, with the combination of birth control and all these things, and gives men the right to just do whatever they want. Boys will be boys, and men, hey, if it feels good, do it. If it feels good, do it is okay for men. But women still bear the consequences of getting pregnant. Once that becomes less possible, and, there's also the thing of women entering the workplace and, all that, then basically the second wave feminists just take that same attitude towards sex and just tell women, you should do that too, which is disastrous, but that's what happens. And so that comes to the next basically part, the backlash and the consequences from maybe 1980 or so until today. So that book, George Gilder's book Men and Marriage, I put that there. He originally wrote one in 1974 or something like that called Sexual Suicide, and then he rewrote the whole thing essentially, and it became this book Men and Marriage. So he was really in the moment advocating against the second wave feminism. And then what happens after that is the third wave feminism, which is just more destruction. It's basically stated goal is abolition of gender and sex norms, and it's aimed at the destruction of the patriarchy. And now the patriarchy is what feminists label everything that's not just total egalitarianism or now intersectionality. It's not biblical patriarchy. Should say biblical patriarchy, I don't believe is the ideal, but it is a positive thing in comparison to barbarism. And essentially what this third wave feminism does is it allows barbarism to reign. Freud kind of did that too. But so there is some good, and there's some good aspects of this, because it does in some ways, it reacts against the bad excesses that had developed in male sexuality. So where they were, an example I do read about is, this Laura Mulvey's the one that came up with this concept of the male gaze, and she was basically reacting to Freud. Everyone had accepted Freud, and she's rightly pushing back on what's wrong with it. The problem is that by reacting just just purely in a reactionary way, she's sort of like affirming that, or she's affirming a binary. She's not finding the truth. She's just pushing back against what's wrong with that. Okay, so then you have now where we live now, the internet age, commodification of female beauty and sexuality, which is good. That's why it's pink there. To capitalize on masculine desire, which is also a good thing. Like, it's good for men to have a sex drive. It's not the libido that runs the universe, but, it's a good thing. Technological prostitution. So now you have this thing where women can make absurd amounts of money by selling their images online, and their activities. And then you have the return of the economically corrupt patriarchy in the form of the sugar daddy. So the way things are right now is that for rich men, they get to live in this kind of Freudian patriarchy thing because they're rich. They can afford. They can use money to get whatever they want. They don't use physical strength anymore. It's kind of economic barbarism. Maybe it would be even a better term. But that's what you have. And then you have women who can make the demands on the selling aspect of it, which turns the men into consumers instead of, marriage partners. And so, that's that whole thing. So basically, the internet is really fueling a bad aspect of female hypersexuality and a huge swath of normal male desire. And then, with the social justice era, the backlash of some of that is really a demonization of masculine sexuality, and it's used to capture female, minority, intersectional political capital. So that's like the woke movement and what it does, basically. And so it's turning white heterosexual men into the scapegoat around which everyone else can unify and attempts to gain political power through that. And then the last little bit there, Jordan Peterson and other influencers, they're helping to reintroduce healthy masculinity, which is good, but it is tainted by lingering Freudian influences from evolutionary psychology of the red pill movement. So the red pill movement is basically just doubling down on a lot of this Freudian stuff. It's looking at more of the natural consequences, studying the hypergamy and stuff like that, but it doesn't provide a good outcome. So the next thing that's happening here, and this is where we are at this day or in the future, is it's the meta-modern free-for-all. So basically, everything that can be tried has been tried, and everything is available to be studied and explored. And because of that, people are turning back to previous things. So what I have here is I'm saying LARP patriarchy. So this is all the trad movements where basically it's not the environment. Patriarchy was a necessary antidote to an environment of barbarism. We don't have that environment. We have an environment where we have great personal freedom and liberty, and women have rights and all this stuff. So patriarchy that emerges from this is a LARP. It's an act, but basically it's this attempt to try to say this is just the fundamental nature of how things are supposed to be. It is going to be this sort of patriarchal system where masculine and feminine, men and women exist in separate ecosystems. And so I think the problem is that it's far more largely male driven. So there's a great desire to reintroduce the masculine half of patriarchy, but there's not a strong movement to reformulate that shadow matriarchy that was a necessary component in the system. And that's why it's LARP patriarchy. And it's blue because it's meant to benefit men, and I think it does benefit men if men can find a woman that wants to live in that way, and it requires them to be. I think any form of patriarchy has to reckon with the fact that like women can just leave whenever they want. They can seek a divorce. Like there's no societal system that's going to remove those things, and so it is that's why it's a LARP, because it's volitional, it's voluntarily choosing to live in a live action role playing worldview. But also in this meta modern free for all, barbarism is well, it's alive and well in like the UK. I haven't delved too deep into all what's going on with those grooming gangs and stuff. But when you have essentially Islam is not really patriarchal. It's more barbaric, especially in some of these environments, and especially as how they view out-group women. So that's bad. But also then you just kind of have this other form of barbarism, which is in like hookup culture, which just benefits men and doesn't really benefit women at all. So that's another form of barbarism. And then you also have asceticism returning in the form of like, these whatever it was, the 4-H or whatever, these women that are forswearing sex and relationships, and men going their own way. That's a form of asceticism. Basically any form of asceticism where people are abandoning marriage and sex and dealing with the opposite sex. Those things are all coming back and making returns. And here's what I'm saying. What is needed is the reintroduction of chivalry, and here chivalry is blue. It was pink back in the Middle Ages because it largely benefited the women. Now I think chivalry is needed to largely benefit men. Because it needs to be chivalry with a more robust emphasis on the normativity of marriage. So it has to be German Eschenbach-style chivalry more than the French de Troyes style. You can't solve a birth crisis without marriage, and you can't eliminate the consumption of negative sexual stuff without a positive alternative. And I think that if men as a movement embrace chivalry, that is the way that they can re-engineer the environment, because we're not in the environment for patriarchy, but chivalry is meant to exist in a free society. So if we re-engineer the environment to support chivalry, that will be good for men. And here's why: the fraternal and competitive aspects of chivalry need to be reintroduced to policemen. See, because part of the problem is that the men who are trying to do things the right way, still have to reckon with the fact that like the women that are attractive have probably been seduced by sucky guys. So, I mean, it's not the end of the world. Christianity deals with this. You can forgive a woman if she's not a virgin, but that is a good thing to normalize, like chastity and waiting until marriage. And unfortunately, so that's an unfortunate thing that a lot of guys have to deal with. And basically it's just like, how do you get, like, there's no masculine forces policing other men. What are you going to do with the bad actors? Anybody who wants to and that's the thing. So basically any guy that wants to live like a barbarian, he's free to do so. Women aren't going to give him the incentive to stop acting that way. So men need to re-engineer the circumstance to keep those douchey guys, basically keep them in check. Women need more societal boundaries that can be provided for a limited time by fathers. So I had this thing where I talked about in the live stream on PBKs the other week about how good fathers of daughters disincentivize their daughters from having children by preferring career over getting married. Now, and like Yosef had asked a question like, well, don't these men have sons too? And it's like, yes, they do. The men that have sons and daughters, the men don't have a problem getting married, because if a man and a, like, let's say you have a boy and a girl that are like twins, and they both are top of their class, and they both get great careers, and they both postpone trying to get married until they're 30. The woman will, and they're both like at the top of their field. The woman only wants to marry a guy that's older and more successful than her. That gives her a very limited, very limited amount of guys that she can choose from. But the guy who's 30 and at the top of his career has a really easy time finding somebody to get married to. He can marry some younger woman at his work, or meet a woman that's younger somewhere else. It's not as big of a deal. So that's why it was the fathers who it affected the daughters, and especially the fathers who only had daughters. But I wrote a whole article on that. But part of the problem is that women, they look for boundaries, and when everything is just, yes, you can do it. You can do anything you want. You can be whoever you want to be. You can achieve everything you want. Like, they, in a sense, like, go insane. And like, there's I saw a really good video about a psychology guy basically talking about, like, especially like attractive women from the time that they're like teenagers onward, no men will be honest with them, because they all are like wanting to have sex with them essentially at some level, or like they won't just treat them like people. And that's because we've all accepted Freud's ideas about masculine sexuality, so men don't even try to subvert those urges in their actions. So basically it's like all the beautiful women have been gaslit by all the men their whole life about everything. They just don't have like a frame of reality. So men can absolutely do that as fathers for a limited time while they have their daughters in their household. But what we also really need is a reintroduction of the shadow matriarchy. So women need to be policing other women, and now, and some of the problem now is like women don't respect older women, because women are all in competition now. Women didn't used to be in competition. They have this fake competition, or they have this fake agreement where they all say every woman is a 10, but they're actually in competition with each other. And so they don't actually have those systems in place where they're learning wisdom from older women, or older women can help keep the young women from making mistakes and all that stuff. So that is, so that's the timeline and kind of the thesis that I'm going off of. And obviously this is a really important problem that needs to be fixed. I guess you could say, in some sense, with my first book, I was worried about the young men that will someday hopefully come to court my daughters, that they would not make as many of the mistakes I made, that they would have more information, that they would be more well-rounded and more well-prepared for marriage when that happens. I guess this next kind of book, or eventual book, is more thinking about like, okay, well, what kind of it's for my daughters themselves, like what kind of an environment are they getting into? What kind of ideas about the relationships with men and women are they being fed? Because it doesn't really help to have the guys know how to do everything right if the women aren't following a corresponding script. So that's where I'm going with the next one. And then the mental health aspect of it is important, because just thinking about like, okay, I think there is something really good about the fact that like we're learning more about like what it means that like people are on the spectrum, and that we can make accommodations for them to have all these good positive experiences like getting married and having fulfilling careers and all that stuff. And I think like the identity politics has gone a little too far in that once somebody has a diagnosis, we just coddle them instead of challenging them and giving them incentives to rise to the occasion. They need their own path. It needs to be it can't just be one size fits all for all of society, but they can get to those mile markers. We just need to recognize that it takes a different pathway for them to get there. So, yeah, so that's what I got for today, and hopefully this is interesting to some people. Thank you.